Hi everyone, it's Adam here from DNF1. Just before we begin the podcast, I wanted to quickly share with you some exciting news. For this month, the DNF1 podcast is proudly sponsored by Manscaped. For the entire month of March, you can get hold of some great Manscaped products like this, and plenty more other great products on their website for 20% off and free shipping.
Oh my god! Wow!
All you have to do is head over to manscaped.com and use our promo code DNF1 to receive 20% off your order and also free shipping too. We loved using Manscaped products and we know that you will too, so make sure to get yours now. Trust us, your balls will thank you. So hello there and welcome to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast, the show where we take all of the latest news, gossip and events in the Formula One world and we relay that back to you guys with a bit of healthy banter and discussion for your listening and viewing pleasure, depending on what platform you choose to follow us on. And as always, my name is Adam. I'm one of the hosts on this series and joining me once again, my co-host, Mr. Courtney Pine. Courtney, how are you doing this evening? You okay?
Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I must say, I'm feeling a real sense of optimism about everything that's going on with the whole COVID situation around the world. Things are starting to look up a bit. I'm feeling a sense of optimism that maybe McLaren fans are feeling at the moment, and that's exactly why we're here.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right to point that out regarding McLaren, Courtney. 1 week to go until the season gets underway at Bahrain. It's so close now, guys. We can literally smell the exhaust fumes from the Formula One cars. Obviously not literally, but it is that close to us and we cannot wait for it to get started. And of course, as Courtney mentioned, this episode is going to be about McLaren. Now, before we do get started, I just want to big shout out to our sponsors, Manscaped. And first of all, I want to thank them for allowing us to run last week's episode without advertisement as a tribute to the late Murray Walker, who sadly passed away. So thank you very much, Manscaped, for allowing us to do that. But incidentally, of course, normal service is resumed. And as the advert suggests, use the code DNF1 on manscaped.com to get 20% off your order and free shipping. So make sure to do that now. DNF1, you get 20% off your order and free shipping. Go and do that now. You will not regret it. Now, of course, let's talk about McLaren, Courtney. The reason why we're doing this episode, McLaren, is since 2012, the last race that they won in Brazil, Jenson Button, of course, the driver to do that, McLaren went through a bit of a downturn. They lost Lewis Hamilton to Mercedes. The performance of the car started to decline. There were issues financially for the team where they weren't able to compete with the likes of Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes in particular, who since then have pretty much dominated the top tier class of Formula One. McLaren also decided to go a different way on the engines. They felt that the only way to compete and possibly beat the almighty Mercedes, little did we know how long this would last. It's still to this day at the time of recording. McLaren decided to go a different route and reignite the partnership with Honda, the partnership that brought them so much success in the late 1980s and of course the early 1990s as well, going proper old school with this one. And it was one for the F1 purists to know and enjoy. We were certainly excited at the time when it was announced.
I certainly was.
Yeah, we certainly were. I think it was early 2014, I believe. In the second year of the turbo hybrid era, Honda would be rejoining the sport. But it was a romance that was probably best left to its heyday during its successful period, and it never really brought any success. If anything, it was almost heartbreaking. It was a very difficult relationship that pretty much was culminated in radio messages from one Fernando Alonso referring famously to the Honda engine as a GP2 engine at no less than their home circuit in Suzuka in front of their broadcasters and fans as well. Probably one of the most infamous radio messages you're ever likely to hear as a Formula One fan. And, let's be honest, Courtney, at that time, McLaren were really in dire straits, coming ninth in the Constructors' Championship in 2015. At that time, obviously, your allegiance isn't to Mercedes at the time, but as a British fan and perhaps a McLaren supporter in some regard at the time, it was very difficult growing up knowing how successful McLaren were when we were growing up as Formula One fans, only to see them fall so far, literally to the bottom of F1's difficult hierarchy.
Yeah, it was sad to see. I can only speak on my own behalf, but the impression I get is that most Formula One fans do have a soft spot for McLaren and Williams. You know, they have a big part to play in Formula One. Let's not forget that McLaren are the third most successful team in Formula One history. And I find it weird, you know, we're discussing this before we went on air. I find it weird that someone like the younger fans is just getting into the sport, sort of see McLaren as a midfield team. And like, when we were growing up, they were one of the teams to beat, you know. Okay, even when Michael Schumacher was dominating, McLaren were there or thereabouts. Had Mika Hakkinen winning in the late 90s. Kimi Räikkönen went close a couple of times. And then obviously they had some good tussles in 2007, 2008. And they were one of the biggest teams. And I'm really pleased that slowly but surely they started to turn it around after, which was a painful time. Like those radio messages about the GP2 engine. Yeah, it was funny to watch. It was Fernando Alonso being Fernando Alonso, but at the same time, it really was. Like, I remember going to the Belgian Grand Prix in 2015, and the Honda engine sounded sick. Not in a good way. It sounded ill. I sound like a nerd, but the Mercedes engine sounded fantastic. You know, the Renault was sort of getting better slowly but surely, but the Honda engine sounded like a donkey in comparison. And I'm just pleased that McLaren are showing signs of them getting back to their former glory.
Absolutely. And of course, let's not forget their last world championship back in 2008, I should say, under Lewis Hamilton. That's how long ago. Lewis Hamilton was a one-time world champion. The last time McLaren won a world championship, how long ago that was. It certainly makes me feel old, reminiscing about the old days. You mentioned the rivalry between McLaren and Ferrari, particularly Mika Hakkinen and Michael Schumacher, of course, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and Lewis Hamilton and Alonso versus Massa and Kimi Räikkönen in 07 and 08, respectively. It just seems such a long time ago since those good old days. But unlike Ferrari, McLaren really did go on a downturn in form and fortunes. Let's not get carried away. Ferrari obviously keeping pace with Red Bull, Mercedes, McLaren struggling. And in that era with the Honda engines, as I said, a lot of the time, McLaren did look like a team that was basically resting on the excuses and putting all the blame on Honda. And at the time, a lot of us were very much convinced that that was the case. You know, there were certain cases where the McLaren looked pretty handy in Fernando Alonso's hands, but the engine power was so bad that they used to go and say that it had the best. I think there was one time, I can't remember who it was exactly, so I'm not going to quote the name, but apparently one of the leading engineers at McLaren claimed that they had the best chassis of anyone on the grid back in 2017, and yet they finished 9th in the constructors. So unless your engine was a go-kart engine that come out of a second-hand lawnmower, I'm pretty certain that the chassis of the McLaren was not the best. I think we could all agree it was possibly the Red Bull or even the Ferrari back then in 2017. That was a pretty handy car. That being said, McLaren in the last few years have gone for a major restructure. They've brought in the likes of Andrea Seidl, the team principal, Zach Brown, the CEO, James Key, the technical director, and this trinity at McLaren has really helped to bring forward this new McLaren, if you like, this updated version that has now risen from F1's pit into possibly breaking into the top tier at the top of the midfield. Last season, 2020, was their best result in the Constructors' Championship, coming 3rd overall, getting 3 podiums in the last 2 seasons, of course. Let's not forget Sainz in Brazil 2019 and Sainz and Lando, respectively, getting a podium each, with Sainz himself believing he should have won in Monza, of course, in that legendary race that Pierre Gasly won. And
very close indeed.
Absolutely agree. And, you look at McLaren now, and there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that I think McLaren fans should be very excited about their prospects. And I think in this podcast, I think we're going to explain, why McLaren's resurgence and how that has happened, and why in particular this year and perhaps the next few years, why I think they should be very excited that McLaren could potentially be breaking into F1's top tier once again. So before we get going with that, Courtney, a few questions from some of our supporters. Thank you so much for those of you that weigh in. Please do weigh in with any questions that you have regarding topics that we do put up for podcast episodes. We really do appreciate it, and we love engaging with you guys anyway. So the more, the absolute merrier. And Courtney, of course, you had a few points that some of our followers were asking regarding McLaren's apparent resurgence to the top.
Now, what I love about these questions is that they're really fitted in well with this episode. by accident. They've covered pretty much every aspect of what makes a Formula One car good or bad. So let's start off with the engine department. A good friend from Vulcan Motorsport, he asked us thoughts on the Mercedes power unit, possibly bringing renewed success on track.
Well, as we've already mentioned, the issues with the Honda engine were there for everyone to see. Since then, of course, we should stress that Honda have come leaps and bounds from where they were to having arguably one of the best engines in Formula One. Not sure where they rank compared to Ferrari at the moment, because of course we're yet to see what that Ferrari engine can do, and also the Honda engine to some degree. But it's a very competitive engine with arguably only Mercedes boasting a better one, as we know. So, you know, it's been good in their part, and obviously we learned a lot from that issue. With McLaren in particular, they have had now almost every single engine of the turbo hybrid here, with the obvious exception of Ferrari. And in that time, they have learned so much about what's worked with their car and what hasn't worked. The Renault engine was an upgrade on the Honda engine at the time, but over the last few years, that Renault engine has really stagnated in terms of progress compared to the other teams. Every single one of them has made leaps and bounds to the front. Renault have really kind of stayed in a stable position where arguably they could be the worst engine on the grid again. As I said, we'll have to wait and see what Ferrari have done. So for McLaren to make this bold switch for 2021 to have the Mercedes engine, which originally was intended for the new regulation cars, which of course has been homologated for 2022 owing to COVID-19, this is a huge statement of intent from McLaren. It goes against the mantra that they probably held back in 2014, where they wanted to go against Mercedes to beat them rather than take their best strengths and then improve on other areas that Mercedes did independently from McLaren and then use that. They've gone back to that. And I think it's a smart decision. I think it's one that was going to happen sooner rather than later. And I don't feel that Mercedes are going to be as confident over the next few years about keeping McLaren back as they probably have in Racing Point. Not to say that Mercedes have held back their customer teams, but there was always the belief that Mercedes really had those teams in check in terms of not allowing them to have too much performance over them. How that happens, I don't know. I'm not suggesting Mercedes are holding their teams back, as some people may feel, or as Ferrari might have done with other teams in the past that's, you know, they supply engines to. But McLaren is a completely different prospect. McLaren are certainly not taking the Mercedes engine to say, great, this will confirm that we finish at the front of the midfield. Now they're certainly playing to win. And I think just as they did in the old days, I think they've got the resources that they need to make that happen. And with this Mercedes engine could turn out to be the final piece in the jigsaw puzzle. So I would be very encouraged, especially from what we've seen from pre-season testing as well.
Yeah, it's been very solid. It seems like all the Mercedes teams didn't have any problems. But I'd like to add, Adam, I do think the Mercedes engine was one of the factors that led to Daniel Ricciardo joining. He made it very, very clear from 2014 he'd love to have a car with a Mercedes motor in it. So definitely, I think this is one of the many factors that has culminated in McLaren, as we stated at the start, potentially going to the very top where in our minds we expect him to be, because that's what we saw growing up.
Well, I mean, you've brought up Daniel Ricciardo, and I think it's worth talking about him just briefly before we move to the next point. Is, you know, back in 2018, McLaren were losing Fernando Alonso. They needed a driver to replace him, and they approached Daniel Ricciardo. At the time, Daniel Ricciardo was unsure about his future with Red Bull, and of course, he wanted to leave the team, and he made that surprise switch to Renault. At the time, McLaren were giving him hypothetical promises of a better team management, a better structure technically, more investment, better engine power, a car that could give him an opportunity to win a world championship. At the time, he said no, he turned it down, and he went to Renault. Ultimately, that project didn't work out for Daniel Ricciardo. The Renault project promised a lot, but given that Ricciardo left or decided he was going to leave the team before a wheel was turned in the 2020 season, it showed that he had no confidence in the Renault project and went straight to McLaren. Of course, his heart might have been set on going to Ferrari first, but I'm pretty sure he didn't hesitate at the prospect of joining McLaren. And given what we've seen in the last 12 months alone, I think you'd agree that Daniel Ricciardo is arguably in the best place right now in his career to potentially win a world championship in the future. He certainly thinks so. And as I said, you've got to look at Red Bull as well. Whilst the Red Bull to Renault switch didn't work out for him, in his defense, Red Bull have not only won the same amount of championships without Ricardo as they would have done with him if it had stayed, but until now, they haven't really looked any closer to beating Mercedes in winning a world championship. As I said, 2021 might be an exception because of testing, but this is.
And let's be honest, he wasn't going to get a chance winning the championship with Red Bull with Max Verstappen. Red Bull have always made it clear that they have their golden child. I know every team does it, but we've seen it particularly at Red Bull. We saw it with Vettel, and now we're seeing it with Verstappen. So I think it was very wise of him to move. And as you've already stated, the way that McLaren are going, this could be ideal for them. No doubt about it.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk about the change of structure. As I said, Andrea Seidl, Ricardo rates him very, very highly. He's a key asset. And I agree. I've seen a lot of the work behind the scenes that Andrea Seidl has done as team principal to really change things at McLaren for the better. James Key, excellent acquisition. It was an acquisition that McLaren tried to bring over quite early a few years back from Toro Rosso, but Red Bull were really trying to stop James Key from leaving the team to go to McLaren. They sensed what an asset he was. I think Red Bull at some point were hoping James Key would succeed Adrian Newey in the future.
That says a lot.
No, it does. They did rate him that highly, and he has proven to be a very huge asset for the team as well. As a lot of the technical prowess at McLaren that has been regained, I think people feel like, where's McLaren's technical prowess gone? I'll give an example. The MCL 35 car from 2020, the start of the season, it was very much an improvement on the 2019 car. It was like an upgrade or an evolution from that. But there were certain facets of that car that was still causing it to struggle. It was reasonably good performance in the mid to high speed corners, like other Mercedes powered cars are. But unlike the Mercedes, unlike the Racing Point, it really did struggle in the low speed corners. McLaren took this 2019 car into 2020 and they looked at things like the side pods and the new nose, the front suspension, the rear suspension. These are all things that they changed quite emphatically on the car. And in the early parts of the season, I think if you remember, they had this big upgrade in Barcelona in 2020, and a lot of these elements of the car were changed, and it coincidentally produced a huge upturn in performance for McLaren. And towards the end of the 2020 season, I think it was Mugello, they realized that the rules were being homologated for 2021 in terms of development, and obviously there was going to be a freeze on that. So McLaren quickly brought forward a new nose, a much thinner nose that we see on the car today, the Mercedes-like nose. And and this was one of the big issues because the nose on their car was quite wide, the Renault style nose at the early parts of last season, and that caused them to struggle in the low speed corners, or they believe it was a huge factor. And they brought this smaller, narrower nose, but it wasn't a complete package. They brought it forward to rush it because they had to, and they had to try and work around it. And McLaren did suffer a dip in form initially because they were trying to experiment with different areas on that area of the car, the mounting structure. Eventually, over time, after a few races where they fiddled around with it, in Sochi, they made changes to the front wing structure as well, made it a lot more narrower, and gave it a lot more options to work with, which then coincided with a huge upturn in form again, which eventually led to them finishing third in the Constructors' Championship. I know it sounds like a lot of technical jargon, but it's that technical prowess that McLaren were able to innovate and improvise when deadlines were set on them and imposed on them, as they have done over winter testing with the limited development that they could have done on the new car to accommodate the new engine. It shows that McLaren, by still being fast and being successful, the technical prowess has returned to the team, perhaps for the first time since 2008, maybe, when they had to build a brand new car following Spygate. So it's so good for McLaren that they're actually returning in that regard.
That ties in nicely with the next question, and this comes from Brian Holmes, and he asks, do you think McLaren have done enough to improve their performance in the slow speed corners? And whilst we're here, Adam, let's talk about this diffuser, which is getting so many fans, well, F1 fans in general, excited.
Yeah, so I've kind of in a way half answered that question already, Brian. So I do apologise for jumping the gun a bit on that one there. Brilliant timing as always from yours truly. But In short, from what we've seen so far, I think, as I said, you can look at towards the back end of last season where the McLaren was really struggling to deal with changeable conditions in terms of wind and also following other cars, mostly because of issues that they had at their front end where it was inconsistent and they were trying to rush these changes with this new package at the front nose and the front wing. When they got on top of that in Sochi around these issues before they could introduce the new package over winter, there were improvements in the low speed corners. I mean, Sochi is a track with a lot of 90-degree corners and a lot of mid to high speed corners, but there were slower speed corners on that track as well. And you could see McLaren's improvement there. McLaren also improved massively in being able to switch the tyres on. I mean, if we look at the performance deficit between all of the teams over the course of the season, McLaren on average was about 4th on outright pace over 1 lap, and Racing Point were just ahead of them. But if you look overall between the midfield where you had Racing Point, McLaren, Ferrari, AlphaTauri and Renault, not necessarily in that order, there was about, on the performance indicators, there's about 0.2% difference between all of those teams. So by that, it was literally a 10th of a second here or there. Literally anyone in that field could have an outstanding lap and make the difference. I mean, look at Charles Leclerc in Sakir, a track where he was never expected to be anywhere near the front and ended up putting it 4th on the grid by putting a great lap together. If you can put your drivers in a position where they can make that difference and have the right drivers, which McLaren certainly do this season, they did last season, let's not forget as well, it is such a huge factor. So in answer to your question in that part, yes, they look like they have improved a lot in the lower speed corners, which is a huge thing. And it looks like they've managed to maintain their other advantages in high to mid speed corners and also looking after the tyres as well. I mean, the last few seasons, McLaren have had to work so hard at trying to mitigate their issues with their car and work at ways to make it better. And I think over that time, a little bit here and a little bit there, working on the small percentages where it can improve, has now culminated in an overall solid package, which can now challenge almost any car on the grid. It is that impressive. And they now have the engine to really add to that as well. It's not perfect. There are still elements that do need work on it. And I think we saw in testing, it's not a perfect car. But as you can see, the overall final product does look very encouraging for McLaren. So I think they've definitely improved a lot. And I think and getting into the diffuser, Courtney, I will make this bit quite brief because I realize I'm going on a lot on this. But the changes that they made to the diffuser within the rules, another example of how their technical prowess has really returned to the team, is the way that they've managed to, those fins or strakes, whatever you want to call them, the way that they've cut them at an angle so that they are still quite long, but comply with the regulations to the point where they've approved them. It shows that level of innovation that McLaren have regained again or has returned to the team under this new technical and management structure. And I feel like with the budget cap now being introduced this season for $145 million, with the new investment that McLaren will have, and of course we'll get into those financial issues in a bit, it shows that McLaren really are in a position now where they not only can have their cake and eat it, compared to where they were before, where over the haves and have nots, but they look like they already have the structure in place and the facilities and everything they need financially to really have a good go at challenging, not only for race wins, but for world championships as well. I do not feel like I'm understating the significance of what McLaren are doing right now.
I think even this season, I think in a exceptional race, I think they're already in a position where they can win races. I think they're in a similar position where Red Bull were in, shall we say, 2017, 2018, just behind Mercedes and obviously Ferrari at the time. I think McLaren in a position where if things go wrong for one or maybe two of those teams, I think they're in a position to win races. And it just shows how far they've come since their struggles with Honda.
Absolutely. Did we have any more questions before we go into why it may not have turned out this way for McLaren and why we should be encouraged even more? Were there any other questions that we had?
Now we have two questions involving the drivers and they tie in well. The first one is another question from Brian, and he asks, who would do better with this year's car, Norris or Ricciardo? And then Sam Jesse Lissenberg asks, will Lando Norris be replaced if he's beaten by his teammate again?
Okay, so I think first of all, it's hard to say at this point how prepared and how on top Daniel Ricciardo is with this new car. From what we see in testing, he looked pretty comfortable. He looked pretty upbeat. He looked pretty happy with everything. So I think it's fair to say that probably more so than any of the other new drivers, with perhaps the exception of Alonso to a degree, Ricciardo's pretty well prepared to pretty much deliver, I'd say, at least 90% of what he can in the McLaren this time next week when we go racing in Bahrain. But at the same time, Lando Norris, now 2 years in the sport already, plenty of experience and shown plenty of pace and good performances. Obviously, second to Carlos Sainz, a much more experienced and perhaps at this point in his career, better driver to a degree, if you look at the all-round package. There's a lot of good things going Lando's way. There is now an expectation. Lando still not considered the team leader in compared to Daniel Ricciardo, but in the same way that he was when Carlos Sainz was in the team, despite having a teammate that's more experienced and at that point in time in their career, a bit more to their driving arsenal, if you like, there is an expectation on Lando with his experience to usually have that as a bit of an equalizer. It carries a lot more seniority in the team, not necessarily a leader, but there is now an expectation on Lando to perhaps find that next level. And that's not an easy thing to do because he's been performing at a pretty good level already. His qualifying pace has been fantastic, and that will be put to the test once again by a very good qualifier in Daniel Ricciardo. But unlike Carlos Sainz, as I mentioned last week, I think, quoting Martin Brundle, I'm kind of glad that the Lando Sainz bromance, as beautiful and as fun as it was to watch, has ended, at least on a professional level, because Daniel Ricciardo will be fun. And he will be very much in good form, in good spirits with Lando as a teammate. But when it comes down to getting in the car and getting the job done, there is no driver that is more prepared and more businesslike behind the wheel in contrast to how he is outside of it than Daniel Ricciardo. And if Lando really wants to really stake his claim as being one of the top drivers of F1 for the future, or maybe even today, he needs to have that same approach, because sometimes I feel that Lando perhaps, whilst there are certain moments that are fun to watch, I mean, let's not forget the team radio in practice at Mugello, where he was singing.
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah, was it singing. And I'm not going to repeat it, but it was so funny, and I love that about Lando, and his team radio's messages are so funny. But sometimes I feel like, is he taking it seriously enough? Is he really?
That's always a big question.
Can he be relied on when McLaren really? There's a level of expectation at McLaren now. I feel last season perhaps a bit more, but now in the future they really are going to have to count on Lando to deliver the results as he has been, rather than providing the meme-worthy moments and the moments where it puts a smile to your face. Because unfortunately, McLaren are not going to be able to cash in smiles over trophies. Daniel, we know, will bring that. Lando, I'm not so sure. We'll have to wait and see, but I'm confident that he can.
This has always been the biggest question mark over Lando Norris. We've always kind of kept an eye on how he was doing in the junior categories, because yes, this term's easily thrown around, but he was hailed as the next Lewis Hamilton, obviously the big next superstar for British motorsport. But when he came into Formula One, yes, he was refreshing. Yes, he's probably helped the younger generation engage with Formula One with what he brings. But there was always this question, as you've already stated, does he take it seriously enough? Is he distracted by the streaming and the connections that he has online? Now, in answer to that question, last season was encouraging. There was definitely an improvement in how seriously he was taking it. Yes, he was still able to have a laugh, but in comparison to the season previous, he definitely improved in that sense with the balance. And with the mindset that he was showing in pre-season with the launch of the car, I think this guy is ready to take more of a senior role in his team. He's been in Formula One for this will be his third season.
Yeah.
If I remember rightly. And I really do believe this guy. I've always had faith. I saw how well he'd done in F2. Yes, George Russell was exceptional, but he'd done well given some of the struggles that he had with the car. I still have genuinely high hopes for this guy. I think if he carries on the road that he's going, getting that balance right, he can put himself up there with the elite in the latter stage of his career, no doubt. So if he carries on the way he's going, I think in response to the second question, I can't see why McLaren would get rid of him. No. I think he's great for the team. I think he still has plenty of potential. And even from a marketing perspective, he's golden. I think he offers so much to that team. I think, let's not understate the let's just say, the contribution that Lando's had to McLaren's recovery, not only just because of his popularity, but because of the pace that the guy has when he needs it.
And I think it's important to note how significant this new partnership will be for Lando Norris. Of course, only having worked with Carlos Sainz as a teammate and having the relationship that those two have had, which of course they will maintain in a, informal, unprofessional, outside of the car, capacity, which is absolutely fine because a lot of the drivers have that with other drivers. And I think Carlos will have the same experience with Charles Leclerc that Ricciardo will have with Norris. But then having said that, I think we can agree that Sainz is definitely a lot more business minded, or a lot more about, let's get this done in the car and then we'll have a bit of a laugh afterwards. I know it's probably an unfair criticism of Lando Norris, and in a way it's not really a criticism. It's more of a, it's an observation that I've noticed with him. And I feel like having a teammate like Ricciardo will do him the world of good to really learn even more so than he already does know of how to be the Joker outside the car. But then as soon as you're in the car, got to get the job done. If you ain't first, you're last, whatever you want. But so, it's good. It's good signs for McLaren. They now have the financial support. They now have the technical structure. They now have the infrastructure, of course, with the new wind tunnel and simulator being approved for development over the winter following new investment to the team, which of course we will talk about a little bit later on. But they now have the driver and also Lando Norris, another driver as well that will really help that. They have the marquee driver in Daniel Ricciardo, who has gone on record in saying he does believe that this is his best chance to win a world championship. And to be fair, I feel like in the next few years, I agree. I certainly do. I don't think Red Bull were able to provide him with what he needed to win a world championship. And I think despite leaving the team, which a lot of people believe was a mistake at the time, Red Bull until now haven't really provided Max Verstappen with a car to win a world championship either. So you kind of got to look at it like that, really, the McLaren project versus the Red Bull project. And McLaren, it's certainly going up and up and up, whereas Red Bull, despite having a strong car by the looks of it this season, we still don't know. We still don't know.
Exactly.
And how many times have Red Bull ended the season with a strong car and not capitalized the following season? That's something that can't be ignored. Whereas McLaren have been making progress bit by bit by bit. So there's no reason to say why McLaren can't do that when the new financial regulations and resourcing regulations are really going to play into their favor, more so than arguably almost any other team on the grid.
Now, this brings us nicely to one of the comments, because I asked you guys, how do you reckon McLaren will get on this season? And the Wheel to Wheel podcast, which I believe you're appearing on Sunday. Am I correct, Adam?
Actually, no, they are going to be appearing on our podcast this Sunday. So,
okay, brilliant.
Yeah, so absolutely. So, some great guys from Canada, Ottawa, I believe it is. So, apologies if I not pronounced it right. But love their Formula One. Big fans of the sport. So they will be on the DNF1 podcast for this weekend's episode. So make sure to tune in to check that out. We're going to be doing a preview of the Bahrain Grand Prix, as well as some other predictions from the championship from our friends over in Canada. So I look forward to that one as well. And of course, I will be featuring on their podcast in 2 weeks' time as well. So definitely looking forward to that.
Well, I like the insight they're giving here. They said that the McLaren look balanced and reliable. They said, we're pretty sure they'll win a race this season. Looking forward to watching the races. And they said, our money's on Daniel Ricciardo taking at least one win. And at this point, I can't argue with them in the slightest, Adam.
No, I think if McLaren are going to win a race in 2021, my money would definitely be on Daniel Ricciardo. As I said, I'm very confident in Lando Norris's ability, and I feel like he's definitely going to go from strength to strength. And hopefully this season we will see a new Lando Norris that combines that speed in qualifying and also strong race pace as well to really get the most out of that car. He needs to make that next step up, and I think that's what McLaren will hope he will, and I'm confident he will too. But as I said, my money definitely on Ricciardo to win a race for McLaren this year. If, of course, McLaren do win a race, there's still a lot of stuff that we don't know, but from what we've seen from pre-season testing, it's very encouraging signs from McLaren at this point in time.
Yeah, well, that's the last of the questions there, Adam. I certainly love what they're giving here. Quite perfectly balanced. This was purely by accident, but it's worked out perfectly. So no complaints here. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And I think, I've mentioned a lot about the money aspect of this. I think a lot of people don't realize that McLaren were in a bit of a dire straits a situation this time a year ago. McLaren was struggling financially. There was a lot of stories around issues with investors and stuff like that. I mean, I'll give you 3 examples for stories that were happening early last year, or even late 2019. McLaren needed to get. There was a financial influx from their Bahrain investors at the McLaren wide group. I'm trying to remember my notes actually. Sorry, I want to make sure I pronounce this properly because.
Good luck, Adam. Fingers crossed for you.
Yeah. So the Bahrainian investors, Mumtalakat. Yes, that's it. Mumtalakat. That is a real tongue twister.
Well done.
So apologies to any of our Bahraini followers if I pronounce that wrong. But the Mumtalakat group, there was a massive financial influx at McLaren with the investors there. Obviously, a lot of the money coming into McLaren has come from the investors in Bahrain. They also had to borrow $150 million from the National Bank of Bahrain as well. McLaren were really in a tough time, and they had to let a lot of people go at the McLaren group, a lot of redundancies, including their racing team as well. That they had to suffer from last season. And not to say McLaren's participation was at risk, but this had the potential to hinder a lot of their projects going forward, such as the infrastructure projects I've already mentioned, to their wind tunnel simulator that are now underway in the works. That could have really put a dent in their long-term prospects if that was delayed or even postponed or suspended altogether. But of course, late last year, before the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, you'll remember huge news about McLaren, where Zak Brown was able to secure the $185 million. Actually, no, it's £185 million, even better. Investment from US investors to acquire 15% stake in the team, which of course would rise to 33% in the team soon. And that extra investment into the team is so important, not to mention the media space involved in McLaren. Of course, the other projects in IndyCar and the McLaren Shadow project, all of these things are good for McLaren. And with that new investment, the new infrastructure, I should say, the new team structure and the new drivers, all the ingredients are there for a very successful Formula One team that now have everything in place to inspire Daniel Ricciardo, not just entice him to come to the team, inspire him to really go out and be as bold as to believe that he could win a world championship with McLaren in the same way that Lewis Hamilton probably felt when he went to Mercedes back in 2013. There are similar hallmarks. Overall, this is huge for McLaren. There was a huge risk that they could have gone downward like Williams did in the 2010s with the financial issues that they had, which of course we've seen a lot more apparent because of COVID in the last few years, which has required them to get investment from Dorilton Capital and change the team altogether. It's a sad story what happened to Williams, and I'm glad that they are now starting to make their way forward. But for McLaren, they managed to avoid this scenario by the skin of their teeth. It really was close. And I don't think a lot of people realize how significant this was. So without going into it too much more, with everything that I've already said and all the ingredients that are there for McLaren, with the car that they have following preseason testing from what we gather, all I can say is, guys, if you're a McLaren fan, be very, very excited. I am very confident that McLaren, if not now, will in the next few years return to F1's top tier, perhaps even more so than Aston Martin are predicted to do. So I think the focus and the media attention has been on them, but I would say watch out for McLaren, guys. Those guys
are the guys to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a higher ceiling for them.
I'd like to add, though, I think it just shows the importance of prize money in Formula One. Some people might have been asking last season, why are McLaren so happy to finish third? But the prize money is so important to keeping these teams running. It doesn't matter how big you are. It's not like football, where the teams sort of rely on the size of their club. It does not matter how big you are in Formula One. You need that prize money in order to progress, because Formula One teams rely on snowballing, positive snowballing more than anything. And McLaren are very much an example of this. They got the new investment, they got the new management in, and the positive snowball effects led to finishing third. And this prize money is going to help them become an even bigger team. And with success, you get the bigger sponsorship deals, you get the bigger drivers want to come and join you. So the way it's going, as you've already said, Adam, if you're a McLaren fan, watch this team in the coming years, because there's plenty to be excited about.
Well, absolutely. And you talk about the business model in the same way that, you compare it to manufactured teams like Mercedes and Ferrari, for example, that obviously there's a lot of interest in their teams that's a part of their overall company. And McLaren do share those similar hallmarks. I mean, other than Ferrari, for example, McLaren are probably the only team in Formula One that have fans that don't swap in and out of the team at circuits all over the year because of what driver drives for them. So, for example, look at Fernando Alonso is probably a very good example. He went from Renault to McLaren to Renault again to Ferrari, and each season you saw that the Spanish fans would change their shirt colours based on what team Fernando was driving for. But at other circuits around the world, you always had Ferrari fans, you had McLaren fans, you had fans of specific teams. You never really cared about what drivers drove for your team. It's like me as a Ferrari fan. You know, I've gone through so many drivers that were rivals of other teams. Obviously, I didn't want to do well compared to Ferrari drivers, but when they're Ferrari drivers, I'll support them. It's the same way that football clubs are in that regard. That's where Formula One is unique. But with the business model with McLaren, I remember when, as I was saying already, Chairman Paul Walsh was drafted in to sort of fix their business model structures because it was in dire straits. And given where they are now, the size of the team, it's so unique in the way that it's an independent team that acts like a manufacturer team, almost like perhaps more so than Red Bull in this regard. And I really do feel that McLaren fans should be excited by this project. I'm very excited for them. And I'm looking forward to seeing McLaren return to the very front of the grid. And I think that's a day that's going to be approaching a lot sooner than people might have thought back in 2015 when Fernando was tippy-toeing around the Suzuka circuit saying that this was a GP2 engine. So, yeah, be excited, guys.
I think that's Fernando Alonso's been a bit unfortunate with some of the moves he's made, because since he's left, that's when the turnaround has happened. So I bet Fernando might be kicking himself yet again, seeing how McLaren could potentially go in the coming years.
Well, there's an article on Autosport that teased this idea that where Lewis Hamilton is arguably one of the smartest drivers in F1 history in terms of picking driver moves at the right time or team moves at the right time, Fernando probably, with all due respect, probably one of the most ill-advised or least intelligent in terms of his driver moves, considering that where he's left and where he could have gone. I mean, there's a great article on Autosport that talks about this in an alternate universe where Alonso makes the right switches at the right times and ends up possibly being a 7-time world champion himself. So, obviously parallel universes and quantum physics aside, that's not that level of podcast, but it's always fun to talk about as well. But as I said, guys, let us know what you think about McLaren's prospects. We've talked a lot already in this episode about why we think McLaren are definitely on the up and up. A lot of it has to do with the boring financy stuff, but in Formula One, especially these days, is equally relevant, almost as much so as the actual performance of the cars on track and the upturn as well. But let us know what you think about McLaren. What do you think of their prospects for this season? Do you think they can win a world championship in the next 5 seasons? Do you think Daniel Ricciardo could win a world championship at McLaren? Let us know what you think. And of course, don't forget, guys, to subscribe to the DNF1 channel on YouTube if you follow this podcast on YouTube. If you don't, make sure to subscribe to the channel anyway. We've got some other videos on there you might be interested in. And of course, make sure to follow us on whichever podcasting platform you listen to us on as well. Don't forget, of course, guys, shout out to our sponsors, Manscaped. Use the code DNF1 for 20% off your order and free shipping as well. Go to manscaped.com, put in DNF1 to get that offer. You will not regret it indeed. And of course, last thing that's to say, Courtney, thank you so much once again for co-hosting this episode with me.
Love doing it, mate. I'm buzzing from McLaren, and so I enjoyed doing this one.
Absolutely. And with the season only moments away, is so excited. But in the next episode, I should say, in the DNF1 podcast, of course, we are going to be joined by the guys at Wheel to Wheel podcast. Make sure to check that out. And we will be doing a retro episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast in the week before that as well. So make sure to check that out. And until then, guys, stay safe. Thanks for tuning in. And we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
See you soon.